This one's a TA-02. This one is a TA-02 T, as you can see here. This is a TA-02 under here as well. This is a TA-02 in there. TA-02, TA-02 parts. This one up here is a TA-02, another chassis kit, another chassis kit. This is a TA-02 as well. That is a TA-02. Recently won this one. Let's see, we won this one as well. That's a TA-02. And you understand this is kind of an addiction or an obsession of sorts. Yeah. That one's a little tougher to explain, yeah. Shh. Right, let's get going on building this TA-02 Racing Chassis Special kit. As we're going to be building this, we're also going to be adding a few different hop-ups, including the carbon fiber chassis, some links, and oddly enough, ball bearings. It's this special release that they did, and they still only included plastic bushings. It's crazy. Anyways, as usual, starting off, we are just laying out all the parts here. Now, what's going to happen during this build is because I'm not going to be using the plastic tub chassis that comes with the kit, I'm going to be using the carbon fiber chassis conversion kit. I'm going to be kind of bouncing back and forth between not only manuals for the car kit itself and the chassis kit, but also some of the hop-ups come with their own special instructions that you now have to adapt because you're using different shock towers and things like that. So it becomes a really interesting build to go through. I got this kit through Bai in Japan. Japan has kind of some weird export rules when it's not like a company like Tamiya or something like that. And one of those rules is they can't send any oil or grease or anything like that through their postal system. This even includes like engines. So you can't even ship engines if there's a possibility they were used at some point because they would have had this oil, so on and so forth. What that means for this is that before it was shipped to me, it actually had to be opened and the oil and diff grease and stuff like that removed. Not a big deal for me. I have plenty of oils and diff greases and lube and whatever sitting around here to work with. But that is one thing that happens when you are ordering some of this stuff from Japan. And for this particular case, I just used some leftover associated ball diff grease. Now, what I like to do, and I've seen a lot of other people do this too, is using kind of a paintbrush or a small, kind of whatever paintbrush to actually apply the grease and also to kind of pick up the individual balls that are going in that ball diff. It makes it so you don't have to use like tweezers or your fingers or something like that. You can just kind of dab the end of that paintbrush and put it into the actual ball diff. Now, constructing this ball diff, you're only doing one for the rear, and we'll get to what's up in the front, but you can actually get a ball diff for both front and rear. It is the Manta Ray ball diff, but it's the same because this shares a lot of the parts with the old Tamiya Manta Ray. So you put these pressure plates on there, and then you start to assemble the ball diff. And one of the specific things is they have these kind of concave washers. I think there's like 3 of them, if I recall correctly. And you do have to place them in a very specific orientation as you're sandwiching it all together. Now, the last thing you're gonna do is you're gonna kind of put on this nut, and that is going to determine how tight or loose your ball differential is. And as you complete kind of that part of the gearbox, you start to actually sandwich these things together. And at this point, I'm actually going to be replacing all of the kind of JIS Phillips head screw or Japanese industrial standard Phillips head screws. They're just a little bit different than what would be considered the number 2 screwdriver Phillips head that we use here in the US. But I'm going to be replacing every screw that I can from my kind of stash of aluminum screws that I have. And most of these are just regular button head 10 millimeter, or they might be the 10 millimeter flathead, which I've just got boatloads of them. So that's pretty much what I use throughout this. Now, what I found out the hard way is that, I don't know if it is this way for the other TA-02 kits where it has the red gear differential cases front and rear, but for this one, the plastic is exceptionally hard. So I actually stripped out one of the screws, and then when I went to go remove it by cutting a slot in it using a Dremel tool, I went to take it out and it snapped the head off. Now I had to drill it all out and then re-tap it. So while I had my tap set out, and here it is, I actually happened to have, of all things, a millimeter or metric tap set, and I had a 3mm tap, so I pretty much tapped every single hole.
Wanna tap it?
Kind of like how I did with the RC10cc kit. Video will be up here somewhere. Now what we're gonna do with this is we're going to try and get it kind of set up as close as possible to a modern touring car. So we're gonna be going with the modern weight that we're supposed to hit. We're obviously using these modern tires that are specs for our particular club. And then I'm gonna be using a 25.5 motor, and we'll get into the electronics in a later video. And I do have some run footage of this at the track and getting some lap times down. But for right now, we're just going to talk about the actual building of it. Now, as you're building the top of this rear differential, this rear gear case, you have these 3 gear shafts that you can put in. Now, they actually did offer at some point hollow carbon tubes, and these are actually pretty heavy. It's all 3 of them together is 7 grams, which is kind of substantial, especially if you're talking about like rotating mass. It's up higher. And, you know, when you're starting to get close to that minimum weight for the touring car class, it'd be nice to shave off, you know, 5-6 grams. So if I ever come across a set of carbon fiber gear shaft tubes, I'm definitely going to put those in here because we could just get it down just a little bit lighter. And as I mentioned, this kit, even though it comes with all sorts of hop-ups that are not only difficult to come by now, but certainly back then would have been expensive, such as aluminum kingpin screws, you have the hardened propeller shaft, you have the front and rear CVDs, you have the sway bar. All that stuff is included with this Racing Special chassis kit, but they still only included plastic bushings. They're still doing this, you know, 30 years later. I have a cache of bearings. Most of the bearings are the same size and the same size that they've been using forever. So I was just able to replace those bearings as I went along. And as a little bonus, most of them were sealed with black, so it just kind of matched the rest of it. Now at this point, the rear gear case is completed. One of the screws that I did not switch to specifically aluminum, but I did switch to hex, was the motor mount screws. Now, the motor mount that I can't remember if the motor mount that came with the kit was aluminum or not, but I had a TA-02 aluminum motor mount, so I decided to use the stainless steel screws on that and a dab of Loctite to put it on there. Now, the way that the TA-02 kit does this motor mount is it has these holes, and those are specific to the gear mesh that you're doing. Now, I believe when they have you set up the kit, it's either 70 something or 69 tooth, and then it'll say like, okay, for a 69 tooth and a spur and a 24 tooth pinion, you put it on this hole. Now, I went and got the high speed gear set, even though it turns out it was included with, again, the Racing Special chassis kit, which is 66 tooth spur, so a smaller spur, and I went with the largest possible pinion I could get, which is 25 tooth. Now I think based on the motor mount, I might be able to move it further away, but I think ultimately the restriction then lies with how big the space is for the pinion in this gear case. So we're running a 25 tooth pinion and a 66 tooth spur gear in Tamiya's mod 0.6 whatever pitch that they have. So it's not 48, it's not 64 pitch, it's not mod 1 or whatever. It's that kind of very specific mod 0.6 if you're going to be looking for pinions for this particular car. So as I mentioned, I was going to be doing a lot of concurrent hop-ups as I was building it, and it just made my bench a total mess. At one point I had 3 different manuals out. I had the manual for the car itself, I had the manual for the chassis, and I had a manual for the upper links that I was using for the both front and rear. As is the case with a lot of Tamiya kits, even to this day with the TT-02 and beyond, especially the BT-01, you got to start implementing the use of shims to get some of the slop out of the suspension. Now in the rear, I had to shim up the lower part at the end of the suspension arm to kind of stop the hub carrier from kind of wiggling around. But we got it nice and square, but it's not so tight that it doesn't move on its own. When I put the rear adjustable upper arm links, that again were a hop up, the angle that it was doing from the rear shock tower to the actual upper part of that hub was pretty steep. I decided to kind of, I would say spacer, not really shim, but spaced it out a little bit from that rear shock tower to kind of lessen that angle a little bit. Now, I went as far as I could go, which was about 2.5 millimeters. That kind of straightened it out a little bit, but also that's about as far as you can go because on the spur gear side of it, that case that comes around and covers the spur gear, that's about as far out as you can go before you can't get the actual ball cup on there. For the rear sway bar, and there's only a rear sway bar in this, I believe I've seen some upgrades that people have kind of like fabricated themselves for a front sway bar, but there was only ever a rear sway bar offered. For this, they tell you to, kind of assemble that rear sway bar, put those ball ends on, and then attach these little turnbuckles that you make to the suspension arm and then to the sway bar. What I would do is actually attach those turnbuckles to the sway bar. You can still fish them through everywhere they need to go and then snap them onto the part of the suspension arm that needs to go onto. It's much more difficult to snap them on when the sway bar is already in place. At least when it's not on there already, you can kind of push down on your bench or something like that. Moving to the front of the car, you are starting to assemble the front gearbox. For this particular kit, and it was a hop-up option that was available at the time, they have a front one-way bearing. That means when you are not on power, the front wheels are actually spinning freely, but when you actually are on power, then they're driving the wheels. But obviously you want to make sure that is oriented in the correct position, otherwise you'll just have basically, a rear-wheel drive car and it won't actually be driving the front wheels, except when you go to let off, then it'll actually drag brake on the front. What was nice is these upper link hop-up option from Tamiya actually came with their own instructions, which Tamiya does a lot. But what was cool is it provided two separate types of instructions. And it provided instructions if you have the stock plastic shock towers, but it also had a sub instruction if you were going to be using the, in the case of the specific manual, the FRP shock towers. But the FRP shock towers are the same shape as the carbon fiber ones. The carbon fiber ones came out later because you actually are using a different hole on the shock tower for these upper links if you are using either the FRP or the carbon shock towers. Now, I've fallen for this a couple times before. I have built a couple of TA-02 chassis and even other Tamiya kits do this too, but they'll have a step where it tells you to put those kind of outdrive joints into the gearbox. What happens is you put those in and then you have to start moving the car around, you have to start attaching things, and they just fall out. So I always wait until I'm actually going to be putting the, dog bones or CVDs or something like that in, and everything gets kind of like held into place. For the bearings on the front steering hubs here, the outside one uses what they call a 1260, which is 12 millimeters by 6 millimeters, 6 millimeter inside. And then on the inside of it actually uses what is, to me, would call a 1510, which is a 15 millimeter outside and a 10 millimeter inside diameter. Now those I don't usually have on hand, but I actually happen to have those on hand. And I can't remember what I'd actually purchased those for, but I had them on hand, so I was able to kind of keep going with the build here. Up front, thankfully, on the lower part, I didn't actually need any shims to get these uprights, these kind of C-hubs, to be nice and snug, but again, still moving freely, but didn't have a lot of slop with them when you built them up. What's nice with this Racing Special chassis kit is it actually uses pins, and I mean, it's not great that they're E-clips, but with the standard kit, it's like this long screw with just a little thread right by the head, and that's what holds it on. But these are actually proper shafts that go in here that hold it in place, and I believe they are technically like a lower friction one as well. Speaking of low friction, you'll also notice that I have the Tamiya low friction dampers, this kind of really cool pink anodized dampers, which don't see very often. I think they only did it for these, and I think they technically had like a TA-03, and I've seen people use these on like old ML1 chassis. So it's just kind of a cool little upgraded part that you don't really see that particular color very often, kind of a pale pink or rose. And the kit itself actually comes with oil dampers, but they are just the plastic oil dampers. So these are a little bit nicer. And building them up, it's a lot of parts, right? Because you have the kind of the ball end that goes at the end, you have all of the O-rings, you have the actual piston itself.
Always think of a third thing when I'm listing stuff.
There's an E-clip on either side of that piston. You have the kind of bladder that goes on top and all of the clips and spring retaining clips and everything like that. So it's a little tedious, but they are really cool. I like them a lot. I love using them on my TA-02 chassis on a few different TA-02 projects. I have these on here and really like them. As I've done with other videos, I do just put a tiny bit of Loctite on the bottom cap of that shock. Again, you know, I had a couple of shocks leak before, and it was due to that bottom cap coming unscrewed. So this just kind of alleviates that. I finally got myself a servo tester to actually get the servo. Usually it's just to get the servo properly centered, because most of the builds that I do are requiring the servo to be kind of like dead center 90 degrees. But what's nice is you can actually have a setting where you can just kind of slowly dial it. So let's say, I mean, I've had a kit, I think it was my TC01, they told me I had to have it at 15 degrees. So I can kind of dial it to that, lock it off there, and then continue the build from there without having to worry about getting the ESC installed and getting the, you know, battery charged up, or, you know, getting it, having to bind it to the receiver, all just to get the servo installed. So it's a relatively inexpensive thing from Amazon. I will link it below, along with like a little battery tray to actually power it. Although I've had success kind of wiring up a USB plug to like a, you know, what would basically be like a JST or Futaba style receiver servo plug. And I've done that. So whatever works for you. What was funny is, as I was putting together this front steering assembly, I couldn't find the flange tubes that were supposed to be included in the kit. So thankfully I had some brass tubes lying around. I did have to cut those down a little bit to fit in there. Seems to have worked out okay, but I have no idea what happened to the flange tubes that were supposed to be in the kit with the specifically with the carbon fiber chassis plate kit. When you are installing the servo into the this should go for the FRP conversion chassis set and the TA-02 carbon chassis plate conversion set, the servo is actually on the other side. So you do have to kind of flip it around. Again, that's included in the instructions with the chassis conversion kit. And like I said, I'm kind of bouncing back and forth between the two instruction sets, the one for the actual car kit and the conversion chassis kit, kind of going back and forth trying to figure exactly which one I'm supposed to be following for that moment. Now, when you're attaching the actual gearboxes, the rear just attaches with a couple of flatheads screws underneath, and then two that go into part of the plastic kind of battery tray here. And then you're going to put on the front, similarly, just a couple of screws through there, and then that top chassis plate goes on there, and it really kind of makes everything nice and rigid. The carbon fiber chassis set, the battery kind of hold-in that comes with it looks really nice. Like it has, you know, little carbon plates, and it has little aluminum standoffs and things like that. However, once I put that all together and tried to fit in kind of the standard hard pack LiPo battery, it just wouldn't fit. I ended up having to get this battery mount set or battery hold set from RC Adong or whatever. I think I got it through eBay, maybe. I don't know. I picked up two of them, and you'll see the other project that I did in the next video. Now at this point, everything's installed. I'll talk about the electronics in the next video, which should be the next video that I put out. And now at this point, it's on my setup board. I have the, you know, whole setup station on all the wheels. And what I'm doing at this point now is just trying to get it to a baseline. My general baseline for my touring cars is 1 degree of camber, and then just 1 degree of toe out. And then to get that ride height at around 5.5 to 6 millimeters is kind of the base. When I was doing the turnbuckles for the steering, which is then going to be the thing that ultimately allows me to adjust toe out, I found that the included ball ends, ball cup, one side of them was too long. So they had kind of a longer ball end ball cup to go on either the outside or the inside, and then a shorter ball end ball cup for the other side of that turnbuckle. I ended up having to use the shorter ball end for both sides of those turnbuckles to allow me enough actual ability to adjust that turnbuckle to get the proper toe out. But I finally did, so that was good. I will say though that all of the starting measurements that Tamiya had with their, especially with the turnbuckles and the upper arm lengths and everything like that, that they gave you in their instructions, like, hey, have it set at X amount of millimeters, was way off. But that's fine. At least it gave me some place to start, or at least have them equal on both sides. I should also note that this battery holder can also be used to get shorty lipos in here too. So if you prefer and are able to run shorty lipos wherever you're running, you can do that. The front bumper here, now originally I was using the original front bumper, and because of the way that new touring car bodies are, the ones you actually like run in the touring car class, not the really nice body sets that come with Tamiya kits, they are so low that I couldn't use the standard body mount posts that came with the kit. So originally in back, it has kind of a piece that comes out and then up, but I needed it even lower, so I was able to just mount it straight to the rear shock tower, which was nice because that actually put the body post holes kind of out from underneath the wing on this particular body and other body as well. Up front, though, I couldn't get the body low enough off of the standard shock tower here. So I ended up having these, I believe were some Schumacher. They were like the optional, I believe they were actually the optional rear body posts that would have gone horizontally out the back of my old MI8. But I mounted it here. There were already holes in the front bumper of the stock TA-02 bumper. So I use those as a way to get the body mounts like lower down. Now, when you notice I switched here to a carbon fiber front bumper, largely so I could get like a larger foam bumper that would fit underneath the body and actually give some protection up here. Usually it's just kind of like a plastic piece. So I really wanted a kind of what's now more of a standard foam bumper up front. This carbon fiber bumper is a tiny bit heavier than the stock one, but it actually works really well and does get that ability to use that bigger foam bumper. On top of that, it already actually had holes in the bottom part of this kind of carbon fiber plate that were countersunk, and they matched up exactly with these body post holes. So even though I'd originally built it and measured it for the body with the body posts in the old front bumper, it actually matched up perfectly with this one. So that was great. However, the last thing I had to do is I did have to trim a little bit of that front bumper to fit the body posts. This is not quite exactly the body that I generally use with my touring car, my MS 1.0, which there is a video I just released on building that one, and the link will be down below or up here or somewhere. This is kind of like, I don't know, it's kind of a little bit like a BMW 8 Series ripoff, but it does get nice and low. It does fit with the touring car class. This is actually a standard weight one. It's by Biddy Design. There is an ultralight version of this. Now, when I weigh all of this, I am about like 20 some odd grams over the minimum weight. The lightweight version of this body, I believe, is about like 15 to 20 grams lighter. So we get real close to that. There's a couple other things I could probably do to lighten this up just a little bit more, but pretty happy with where it is weight-wise. And I think this looks great as it is. This body is a little bit narrower than some of the standard touring car bodies that are out now. And the track width on this Tamiya is like 182 millimeters, whereas the track width on my Yokomo is almost 190 millimeters. So it does seem like the wheels are way inside on the Tamiya. The last thing I want to mention here is the blue plastic knuckles, steering knuckles on here. One of them split right away just at the hole when I installed the ball end. I don't know if it's just how those actually are, or if it's just because that has been sitting in a box for a long time and getting brittle. I did have a set of aluminum knuckles, so I was able to put those on here to kind of save my race day, because I did actually take the track. I did get some laps in, I did get some times, and we'll be going over that in the next video. But for right now, please remember to like and subscribe. Like I said, I have another video coming up on actually running this car and tuning it a little bit and seeing where it could do a little bit better and where it's coming up a little bit short. Plus, I have a lot of other videos coming up, so please join us for that. That's all I've got to say on this. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk RC again later. Thank you.